Hi everybody, welcome to Sunya IAS. Welcome to the mains article discussion. The topic for today is biodiversity framework and the indigenous people. Now, the recently concluded 15th COP, Conference of Parties, to UNCBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, was concluded. And there was a group which represented the indigenous people. Now, this group spoke about supporting, protecting, and conserving the rights of indigenous people. Okay, now we have seen that there is a very important link between the biodiversity and indigenous people. Let me just give you a couple of examples. We have heard about, for example, in India, you have Bishnoi community. Okay, there is Kani tribe, Soliga tribe, and of course many other tribes and different primitive groups. Now these groups share a very integrate relation with the nature, okay, and because of the kind of interconnectedness they have with the nature, they protect a lot of biodiversity, okay, and second, they have deep rooted traditional knowledge. Also they have a lot of sustainable practices which all of us can learn from. Fine. So if we are able to integrate the need for conserving the rights of the people, this makes the contribution of indigenous peoples important. Now, for the first time, at least in this particular COP, a legal framework has been made out which incorporates the main need and the rights of this people. So we will understand this from particular mains perspective, and I will give you names of other important tribes as well, which you can definitely use in your mains answers, right? Now, just to give you a brief background, the 15th COP to the CBD happened, which had some major outcomes, out of which one was also the respect for indigenous rights. So first we will see this, okay, and then after that we will also see, for example, that what is the challenges which are faced by the community and what can be done about it, okay. So again, for example, just a very brief overview, that we have a biodiversity framework. Why is that? Because of the important services which biodiversity gives us. We have provisioning services, let's say food, timber, fuel, fodder, etc. There are regulating services, there are supporting services, again microclimate regulation, okay, services which improves, let's say, improving the water quality, microclimate, let's say, regulation, etc., right? So all this is, and again very important, that there is a high level of biodiversity present in the region, right? So this of course provides for us a big ecosystem balance. So generally speaking also, that biodiversity again plays a very important role, right? And within that we created a framework under CBD, okay. Now of course this is the main points, which again are the main points which you know with respect to the importance of the biodiversity, right? So we know that there are multiple ecosystem services which it provides. The disruption of biodiversity causes degradation, which we'll see shortly, and then again the very important role played by indigenous communities, okay. And again these are your unidentified assets. Why? Because the general notion of GDP, gross domestic product, does not include the environmental contributions within it. Fine. So while they are unidentified assets, but the biodiversity plays a very important role. Fine. Now moving forward, so there is a Kunming-Montreal Pact. So the Kunming is a place in China. Here the virtual meet of the COP happened. Montreal is in Canada. Here an in-person meet happened, okay. And this is the 15th COP. This is the most recent one. Now why was this important? Before this, before this 14th COP and other COPs, we had Aichi biodiversity targets. Now these targets were to be achieved. So there were 20 targets to be achieved by the year 2020, okay. Now since 2020 was done, so we wanted to have a proper framework beyond 2020. So one of the main goals of this framework was to set the agenda post 2020, and in this context we will see the role played by indigenous communities as well. Okay, so in the Kunming-Montreal Pact, there are multiple things which I'll tell you. So let me just firstly outline these. So it spoke about number one, the sustainable use of genetic resources. Now, in your prelims, while reading CBD, you would have read about Cartagena Protocol and you would have also read about Nagoya Protocol. This is where in mains you can use this knowledge, use the important keywords convention to fetch more marks. So sustainable use of genetic resources or access and benefit sharing under CBD is spoken under the Nagoya Protocol. So yes, this is one thing we need to know, that this is, it speaks about it. It talks about the sustainable regulated trade of wild animals. Okay, so this is also one of the components here. Next, it talks about the rights of indigenous communities, which is going to be the focus for us. Okay, that the very important communities, what are the rights they should have. Okay, I'll just speak about it in a couple of moments from now. It also speaks about a 30 by 30 target. 30% of the land and sea to be saved till the year 2030. So after the IHE targets were done, so we created now a 10-year framework to save 30% of the land and sea by the year 2030, right? Again, this spoke about sustainable agriculture and minimizing the emissions from agriculture. Then biodiversity inclusive urban planning, right? So even in the urban planning, we see that sometimes the way the cities, the metros, everything is planned, sometimes biodiversity is not given enough weightage, which is why it is important to conserve and include it in the planning. Better protection for degraded areas. Okay. Now, with respect to invasive species, it highlights that there is a need to reduce the invasive species by 50%. Invasive species are your non-native species. Now, they are also known as alien species. And of course, in the prelims, we have read that a species becomes invasive when it rapidly multiplies and ultimately outcompetes the native plant. Okay, which because of this, it becomes a threat to the biodiversity. Okay, and then again, it talks about cutting pollution. Fine. So out of this, again, our focus today is going to be, we're going to focus on the rights of indigenous community and basically understand comprehensively from the mains perspective, what is the important role these indigenous communities actually play. Okay. Right. So urban planning, I think I've already spoken about. So these are the few things that you need to know, that what are the major outcomes or the kind of pacts which were signed under the UNCBD. This is your 15th COP. Now, this was the background I spoke about. In CBD, we read about Cartagena, we read about Nagoya, both are important. This, the Cartagena protocol basically talks about the biosafety related to genetically modified organisms and living modified organisms. So again, if there are any genetic changes, etc., the movement, transfer, export of these species and the biosafety aspects related to them would be covered under Cartagena. Now, what is Nagoya important for? Nagoya talks for access and benefit sharing, and again I'll explain this through an example. And this is where again the rights of the indigenous communities have to be respected, right? For example, I talk about the Nilgiri region. Okay, in Nilgiri region there are many tribes. Let's say one of the tribes uses their traditional knowledge. Okay, so they use the lot of herbs, trees, and for a medicinal purpose, and they are able to tackle a disease. Now, if somebody, an MNC comes in, they use the knowledge, they get commercial benefit out of it, but they do not share the access or the benefit, which means they do not share the revenue or the proceeds from what they actually extracted from these indigenous people. What does this mean? At least in the words of CBD, of course, this is known as biopiracy. And this is again one of the bigger threats to the rights of indigenous people. That is why we have mechanisms under CBD, let's say Cartagena, Nagoya, and that is why there is more emphasis in the recent COP that yes, we need to save the rights of the indigenous people. This is only one dimension, that you are exploiting them, the traditional knowledge, commercially. There can be other issues which we'll see again with respect to land, with respect to their own protection. What are the remedies which are given to them? That is why mainstreaming them and putting their rights in the forefront is very important. Okay, so first of all, we'll understand this whole framework in this manner. Yes, there is a Cartagena protocol, Nagoya protocol, right, which you can definitely use in the parts explaining what is the, let's say, what are the outcomes of the 15th COP. Okay, so you can reference this as well. Okay, now what are the main demands from the indigenous people? So one, they are talking of a human rights based approach. In many cases, there has been a lot of eviction of people from their own natural areas. A lot of exploitation has been done. So number one, they demand for a human rights based approach in which again their rights are respected. Again, let's say their relationship with nature is also valued. And then we talk about a clarity in the objectives. Now, many a times they were not, at least the rights of indigenous people were not properly outlined, which led to a lot of ambiguity. That way, if you want to save an area, whether do you want to save only the area or should you include the indigenous rights as well? The documentation was missing. So again, there was a wholesome clarity. Okay, in this sense, the clarity was not, let's say, there, which is why there is a demand that the post-2020 biodiversity framework should have clarity with respect to how, what are the rights and how should the rights be, let's say, given due weightage. Fine. And then ultimately everything is about the recognition of the rights. Let's say I give you an example. We have read about the Forest Rights Act of 2006. Now, why was this act very much important? ये एक्ट इसलिए बहुत ज़्यादा ज़रूरी था, and let's say one of the reasons was that it gave legal or recognition or the title rights to the forest dwellers. And उसी वजह से there was, because previous to that, number one, land reforms was already a problem in India. Okay, so the people who were the legal, let's say, owners of the land could not get recognition earlier. That is why this was important. In the similar manner, अगर एक international framework है, if there's an international framework in which you are able to quantify or at least list down the important rights, that in itself is a landmark achievement, right? So it also talks about the recognition of the rights, right? Now this point is very important, and this is where we can differentiate our answer. What is the role? Role क्या है indigenous communities का, right? And sometimes we have a very basic understanding. यहाँ पे I will give you examples from India and globe. Okay, there are very interesting examples, things that you should definitely be knowing. Okay, so one by one I'll talk about these. Okay, now the indigenous people and the biodiversity, they complement each other. Okay, now in this regard I'll give you a very good example. There are Maoris. Maoris are there in New Zealand. Now the Maoris in New Zealand, they have a very important concept of guardianship, and in this sense these people complement each other, right? This concept is known as, the whole concept is basically known as Kai Tai Kitanga. Okay, which essentially means you don't have to remember the exact name, but yes, this actually means guardianship, that they becomes the guardians of the area, and that is why they say they are able to save or protect the area. This is the example of Maoris. Then there are other communities. For example, in India, I gave you the example of, let's say, Bishnoi communities. Okay, or let's say you had Soliga tribe. Soliga tribe again plays a very important role in tiger conservation. So not only do they save the nature, in the sense biodiversity, but they also protect the wildlife. Okay, so this is one. So again, this point, if you want, you can write down. This is separate. Kai Tai Kitanga. Okay, they might be slightly different pronunciation. Kai Tai sorry, Kai Tai Kitanga from Maoris in New Zealand. Okay, I'll give you other examples here as well. Okay, so they complement each other, right? They defend their food sources. Okay, so again, they get and extract a lot of benefits, for example, minor forest produce, etc., from the biodiversity. So in that sense, they are always in the habit of saving them. Here also, I will give you an example of Maasai tribe. Okay, so again, there is a Maasai tribe in Kenya. They also have a wonderful habit of defending their own food sources. That is one thing, right? Again, they have a nomadic lifestyle. Okay, and in that nomadic lifestyle, they are able to conserve their savanna environment. This is one. They safeguard the flora and fauna. Okay, again, we can go about the Bishnoi communities in Rajasthan who play a very important role. Okay, there is again a Kani tribe which again safeguards a lot of flora. Now, this Kani tribe also has created a drug known as Jeevani. Okay, from Arogcheva plant. Now, this Jeevani or from the Kani tribe again is important. Okay, now this is also used to treat disease as well. So the point is, not only do they safeguard flora, not only do they defend their food sources, but they are also using their traditional knowledge. Then there is a concept of sacred groves, which means there is a cultural element as well. Many of these tribes have very religious and a spiritual relationship with nature. Okay, so they worship areas, that is why they become sacred groves. In this, you can again link it with Maasai. You can also link with Maoris of New Zealand. Okay, these examples you can use. Again, in the case of, for example, India. Okay, so I gave you the example. I can again give you example. For example, the Lepcha tribes in Sikkim, especially in the Kanchenjunga National Park, they also worship. Right? Again, we have seen that, for example, Bishnoi community also worships or has their sacred groves. For example, they have their khejri tree as well, which they worship. Okay, so first we have to understand what is the, there are multiple roles here. Okay, so they, number one, help in conservation of the environment. So in addition to this, okay, in addition to these 4 points, we can also say that the communities, okay, they definitely also, let's say after this, I can also talk about traditional knowledge. Now do focus on traditional knowledge. Why? Because this is again linked with biopiracy. There are so many tribes both in India and the world whose knowledge can be used in a lot of medical formulations. In fact, they have been able to treat a lot of regular diseases by using the knowledge of herbs, shrubs, plants and trees. Okay, in fact, I just gave you the example of Kani tribe, okay, which has the drug known as Jeevani. Again, there are tribes which use ashwagandha. There are tribes which have used a lot of, let's say, turmeric formulations related to tulsi, which again can be both antibacterial, anti-inflammatory. So a lot of this traditional knowledge can be used. In fact, it is being also used by pharmaceutical companies. It can be used in a proper way as well, but again, if it is not used in a proper way, that is biopiracy. So they are very important for traditional piracy as well, or sorry, for traditional knowledge. Okay, again, a lot of these have very sustainable practices, right? Now sustainable practices can be in agriculture, the kind of bond they have. So again, this is going to complement, right? So again, a lot of primitive conservation agriculture techniques will have less tillage. Okay, so again, this will be a component that can be very much useful. So they can involve a lot of sustainable practices as well. They can also have, okay, or let's say their knowledge can be used. For example, what is their role? It can help us mitigate climate change. Okay, the nature first approach, okay, the nature first approach here ultimately helps in conservation. How? So again, I'll give you example. For example, the indigenous people and local communities in Australia, for example, again in Australia, you have a lot of indigenous communities, you have a lot of aboriginal tribes. Now, in this, at least the land occupied by the indigenous people and local communities, around 50 to 60% of the biodiversity lives in that. 50 to 60% of the biodiversity. Imagine. Okay, so if you actually conserve them or give them proper rights, ultimately we will be able to save this part. That is why this is important, that 50 and 60% of the biodiversity in countries like Australia falls under the land or the area of the indigenous people and local communities. Again, a prominent point for us to go for their conservation, right? So this is one thing, and again they have good ecosystem practices. They go for a lot of, let's say, in situ conservation. All of this makes the conservation and the rights and the impact, in fact, of this role of indigenous groups extremely important in the conservation of biodiversity. Okay, so again, I think I gave you some examples from India, and I think two particular examples. One was Maasai from Kenya, okay, and the second was Maoris from New Zealand, which again had the concept of guardianship. They see themselves as the guardian, okay, and again this is a very important role which they ultimately have and actually carry out. Okay, so this is one. Now everything looks fine, but again this is again an important point, which is why there was a call for respecting the rights of indigenous people. So we're talking of what are the challenges which are faced by indigenous people. Okay, now before even we outline, I on a lot of practical examples which we can brainstorm right now. For example, there are legal challenges. Okay, again, for example, in India you have the Forest Rights Act. A lot of claims made under the Forest Rights Act are so many times challenged, and it goes to the Supreme Court. Second, there are a lot of issues related to eviction. So sometimes the eviction can be forceful, not forceful, right or not right. So there are a lot of legal hurdles which the people face ultimately because of the land and the area in which they live in. Fine. Second, many of us are familiar with UNESCO World Heritage Sites. So for example, if there is a natural site, now this natural site is now given a UNESCO tag. Okay, what will happen? That the people who are living in this close harmony with nature, now this area will be visited by a lot of technicians, by a lot of people from, or the officials, because of the greater, let's say, recognition which is given. So which breaks the kind of relationships which these groups had. Okay, then again, let's say, going ahead with FRA, the implementation of FRA within India from state to state is very different. States like Karnataka have very, let's say, very little or very less implementation of FRA, and which has been criticized by a lot of environmental experts, which is again a problem. Okay, then one of the bigger issues is that their rights are not recognized. They are not, or at least their concerns are not documented in proper frameworks, which is why this current demand of including this also makes a lot of sense, right? So there are a lot of the challenges which they face. The challenges are also economic, again because of a lot of disruption, a lot of intervention by humans. They are also losing a lot of livelihood because of this. Okay, so these are the challenges. Again, let us see this. What are the main challenges here? So first one, I had told you that if there is a designation of a World Heritage Site, there will be more intervention by humans and other, let's say, officials. This is a problem. Okay. Then slack implementation or a very weak implementation of Forest Rights Act. Okay. And we have seen this in, let's say, in the case of Karnataka as well, that there is a very slack implementation. Now, third point is very important. The constant debate between development versus conservation. Now, if you go for development, let's say, you have to clear some forests. So what about the people living in? They have to be rehabilitated. If they are properly rehabilitated, again, what would you do about it? So again, if you go for development, there is always a trade-off between how much conservation can we do, how do ultimately protect the rights of the people. Okay, so this will always be a tussle, and here proper policy and proper legal, let's say, recourse should be applied, right? That if the people have been forcefully affected, wrongly affected, the rule of law must follow. Okay, so within this development versus conservation, again, this is why it is said that the environment impact assessment, EIA, should be carried out taking a lot of experts' opinion, having proper public consultation, so that the rights of the people do not get impacted, right? Next, a lot of human rights violation we have, हमने बहुत बार देखा है that in implementing a lot of let's say projects, if there is a forceful eviction, again, for example, I can give you example of Dongria Kond. Okay, so now in the Niamgiri hills of Odisha, okay, the Dongria Konds faced a lot of trouble. Again, the whole issue of the bauxite mining, ठीक है, वेदांता कॉर्पोरेशन वाला जो पूरा इशू था. So there were cases of human rights violation. Again, if you do not respect the land rights of the people, if you forcefully evict them, rehabilitation अच्छे से नहीं है, if we are not consulting them, if we are not taking into account Gram Sabha plays a very important role. So because of all these factors, there will be a lot of challenges faced by the indigenous people. ठीक है, आगे, again, this is a problem that we use GDP as the chief determinant of development. It does not talk about the rights of the people. It does not even talk about nature. So agar nature is also getting deteriorated, lost, but the development is going on, the GDP would still increase. This is also a challenge they face. Okay. And then there is, for example, one of the challenges that the alternative need or the meaning of capital. Okay. अब हमें जो एक जरूरत है, बिकॉज भी एटलीस्ट इस पॉइंट को अगर मैं एक्सटेंड करूं लॉजिकली, दैट अल्टीमेटली जो कैपिटल है, कैपिटल वी ओनली सी फ्रॉम द इकोनॉमिक सेंस, but practically speaking, and think about nature and think about a lot of tribal indigenous communities and the groups associated, for them that is their main capital. Okay, and here we want in capital our definition should be inclusive, it should respect the rights of the people. And that is why जो ये सारी issues हैं, that if you really want to save biodiversity, you have to bring in people. There has to be local and indigenous community participation, because if it is only the, let's say, responsibility of the state forest government, again there will be no, let's say, sense of ownership. And in places where we have been able, जहाँ पे हम लोगों को साथ में ला पा रहे हैं, where we have been able to bring the people together, that is where we have been able to conserve. इसीलिए we need to conceptualize an alternate meaning of capital, which should be inclusive, respecting the rights of indigenous people. Okay, तो ये भी जरूरी है यहाँ पे, that we first of all understand, हमें समझ में आए क्या challenges हैं. The moment we understand what the challenges are, then we will be able to solve it. Okay, अब क्योंकि we understand the kind of demands here, तो इसलिए ये जरूरी है that what is actually the significance of this framework. Okay, तो यहाँ पे पहली कुछ, there is of course a lot of good points here, that number one, we have to, in fact, if we are able to implement this and we recognize the important rights, we would be able to prevent extinction. Otherwise, there is a very rapid loss of biodiversity happening. In fact, WWF's Living Planet report highlights that in the last 50 years, 69% of the wildlife has been lost. Now, if 69% of the wildlife is getting lost, okay, so to prevent a extinction of sorts, you need to ensure that the local indigenous people are given a central role in its conservation. That is why the concepts like joint forest management, where the local people, indigenous communities take a participative role, becomes very important. So we want to prevent extinction. वी वांट टू इम्प्लीमेंट सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट गोल्स। अभी थोड़ी देर पहले मैंने बात करी क्लाइमेट चेंज की, तो सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट गोल फॉर क्लाइमेट चेंज SDG 13, SDG 14 लाइफ ऑन वाटर, 15 लाइफ ऑन लैंड। तो अगर हम इस फ्रेमवर्क को इंप्लीमेंट करते हैं, वी विल बी टैकलिंग क्लाइमेट चेंज, वी विल बी एबल टू हैव अ लाइक सस्टेनेबल लाइफ बिलो वाटर एंड ऑल्सो ऑन लैंड। ठीक है, इसीलिए बहुत जरूरत है टू रिस्पेक्ट द राइट्स ऑफ द इंडिजिनस पीपल। ओके, देन again, because if we are able to implement this, it will help in providing better ecosystem services. Agar biodiversity, if the biodiversity will be there, so we will have more purification of air, water. Again, that's a important regulating and important service. Generally speaking, all the ecosystem services like providing food, so provisioning services, cultural services, regulating services, okay, all these services would be provided. That is an add-on. Okay, and there will be sustainable use and benefit sharing. आज से याद रखिएगा, the moment I say benefit sharing, in my mind we will think about Nagoya Protocol, which makes access and benefit sharing a very paramount need. कि access और benefit sharing की बात करेंगे हम. Okay, तो ये सारी चीजें होंगी, and it is very important to put these things in a framework. Just think of the legal consequences. अगर एक legal international treaty में, if you are putting the rights of the indigenous people, this will help the respective national governments and the state governments to then have proper legislations through which we can safeguard their rights. अगर हम ऐसे international framework में, if we are not able to mention or the need of their rights, how would we be able to conserve? हम फिर कैसे वो rights ensure कर पाएंगे? इसीलिए ये चीज बहुत जरूरी है. ठीक है, this is the main significance of the framework, because the indigenous people have a very vital role in the conservation of biodiversity. Okay, and then of course अब ये mechanism है, how will it be implemented? Now again let us try to generate few points. Let's think from the main angle. अब if there is, let's say there are some points which were mentioned, ठीक, we wanted to implement those points, how would they be implemented? पहली बात तो we need money. Okay, so money would be needed at, of course, the international level. It should be, let's say there are rich countries, they should be able to contribute some money, so there should be a funding mechanism here as well. Okay, so that is number one. Then of course we should have some properly defined objectives, goals. What are we targeting for? Is it measurable? In what is the timeline, etc. है ना? तो इसको implement क्या करेंगे? So based on the framework, okay, जितने भी member nation है, whosoever are the member nation, they should have or create updated biodiversity strategies. Let us give India's example. India has the Biodiversity Act of 2002. Okay, because again India became a signatory to CBD, that is why we enacted this. So अब based on this act, this let's say framework, it is asking the member states to update and create their own national biodiversity strategy. पहली चीज. Okay, और उसमें भी they have given, for example, few years, let's say 2026. By this time you should be able to do this. By 2029 you should be able to have this particular strategy. Okay, so timeline based strategy has been there. Then it is important to review the existing laws. क्या हमारे existing laws में is there enough scope to include the modifications? अगर नहीं है, the laws have to be amended, right? And again, this is one big benefit of having a international treaty, because it tries to bring the plight or the issues faced by all the indigenous people in one fold, right? Then we have to think about a sustainable consumption model, ठीक है, which ultimately will aid us in sustainable development. तो यहाँ पे भी how should the consumption be, ये भी सोचना पड़ेगा, right? So again, when I'm talking of sustainable consumption, again think of access and benefit sharing, so that it should not be that we are overtly exploiting the nature, the biodiversity resources, but we are not thinking about the sustainable use. Okay, now I told you there would have to be funding arrangements. For example, the signatories, so overall they're trying to raise, for example, $200 billion per year The wealthier countries would also contribute $20 billion each. Okay. Overall combined, the convention has to raise $500 billion per year, but there are different breakups for different segments. Okay. There is a special trust fund. So you have the Global Environment Facility. In this facility, there are provisions and there's a special trust fund jo create karega. And again, funding arrangements have to be there. Otherwise, how would you be able to conserve, right? So this again would help implement the mechanisms, right? So this is how the mechanism is going to be. Okay. And there is also a roadmap shared, right? So I told you एक 30 by 30 target hai. Okay, that 30% of the land and sea to be saved by 2030. Okay, and then there is a roadmap for 2050. So there is an implementation strategy for the 2030, right? So I did tell you it will talk about the reduction of invasive species. It will talk about bringing the efforts of national and state governments in harmony. Okay, having better strategies for protected areas. Okay, so the strategy for 2030, at least in this sense, is very clear. Okay, कि 2030 की जो main strategy है वो बोलती है, देखो, how can you understand 2030 is the year in which you have to achieve your SDGs as well. तो यहाँ पे जो भी हम points है 30 by 30 strategy, everything should complement the implementation of sustainable development goals by the year 2030. And for now, remember SDG 13, 14 and 15, climate change, life below water and life on land. So the first phase, at least till 2030, what we have to do, हमें कोशिश और हमें पूरी तरह से sustainable development goals को implement करना है. Okay, and the global biodiversity framework goals for 2050 are very broad, that we have to think about the ecological health of ecosystems. We have to prepare a long-term roadmap. The individual member nations have to think about their own national biodiversity conservation strategy, right? So ultimately it talks about, and ultimately you have to mainstream the rights of the indigenous people. So 2030 ka implementation is going to be, of course this is a short term target, this is a slightly longer term target. Long term target ke liye we have a long term vision that ultimately we want to preserve biodiversity, right? And this is how we started the lecture. Ki biodiversity has so much benefits that you have created a global framework. In that global framework, you want, and you also want to outline the important roles played by national government, different stakeholders, right? तो ये सारी चीज अगर हम integrate करेंगे, talking about the health of the ecosystem, right? What would be the roles, responsibilities of the different member countries, how to achieve that, okay, generally, how would the funds be allocated, and finally, how everything would be implemented with subsequent time. So this is what is the basic roadmap which is to be there, right, which is to be understood. Now, what is the impact of this framework on India? Even if we do not start, by now you already know, the students here, from the mains we have known that yes, India has a Biodiversity Act. India also has mechanisms to implement Cartagena Protocol and Nagoya Protocol. So now let us see Global Biodiversity Framework हम इंडिया में कैसे हम implement करेंगे. Okay? अब अभी जो recent framework है उसमें India made certain demands. These demands were related to some subsidies, allowing the fertilizers or the pesticide use. Okay, so this has been allowed. ये allow कर दिया गया है. So at least for India, these things have been given a proper, let's say, because a lot of voluntary pitching was done by India. So इसके लिए एक तरह से परमिशन मिल गई है. दूसरी चीज है फ्री टू अडॉप्ट. ओके, सो इसका सिंपल ये मतलब है कि वॉट एवर टारगेट्स वी हैव स्पोकन अबाउट एंड वॉट एवर आर द टारगेट्स मेंशन्ड, वी आर फ्री टू अडॉप्ट देम. सो अगेन डायरेक्टली एक यूनिवर्सल इम्पोजिशन नहीं है टारगेट्स का, विच अगेन गिव्स अस मोर लेग रूम एंड स्पेस टू थिंक एंड प्लान फॉर आवरसेल्व्स. Okay, and again I told you जो भी इंडिया ने टर्म्स रखे थे, again including the subsidies which are needed, the use of fertilizers for agriculture. Again for us agriculture is very important for ensuring food security. In fact, when you read in WTO and other agreements, especially in WTO's agreement on agriculture, we have, and again at the Doha level, Doha summit, so there have been some certain issues to which India has not agreed to. एक proper developing versus developed countries की debate चल रही है. Okay. In this same manner here, India has also has mentioned some terms and conditions, some concessions. All of them have been agreed, and in addition, India is free to adopt all of them. Fine. This is one part. This is the more just say specific part, but generally speaking, you also know that beyond this, India has implemented the Forest Rights Act of 2006, the Biodiversity Act of 2002. While we can agree that there are some lacunas, but still we are implementing them, and whatever are the lacunas, they can be improved over a period of time. Okay, so this is again one more important thing. Now, अगर वे फॉरवर्ड देखें तो देखिए हमने अभी पूरे लेक्चर में अभी तक वी हैव स्पोकन अबाउट indigenous communities. We have seen the examples of indigenous communities, the important role they play, the role or at least the framework of COP 15, and within that the rights, why is there a need of rights. तो अब देखते हैं आगे what can be done here. Okay, very important, and then in fact the most will be recognition of the rights of indigenous people. Now the moment you recognize them, it has three sub dimensions. Number one is cultural, that you accept and acknowledge their cultural contribution, number one. Second is legal. Again, if this thing makes to the main treaty, अगर वो treaty में mention हो जाता है तो इसका मतलब है legal recognition भी मिल गया है. तो cultural recognition is at its one place, but legal is another, right? And third will be the social aspect of it. Okay, the overall social conditioning, the social, let's say, relations which the people, let's say the tribal people or the indigenous people have with their community, that also gets a lot of recognition because of this. Okay, so this is important. Then I told you that there are certain issues with FRA. So FRA has to be implemented in the most effective manner. ठीक है? FRA means the Forest Rights Act. This has to be done in the best possible manner, right? Traditional knowledge for tribal people, for the conservation. अब traditional knowledge के लिए we have the traditional knowledge digital libraries. Okay, now this is of course under the Ministry of Ayush. Now we are trying to protect and preserve the traditional knowledge of these indigenous communities. Again, number one, for the issues of preventing biopiracy, for implementing Nagoya Protocol, but it is more a recognition of the very important contributions the people play. इसीलिए ट्रेडिशनल नॉलेज को प्रिजर्व करना, डॉक्यूमेंट करना बहुत जरूरी है. Now, the tribals are actually the scientists of the forest. They've been living for a very long time, right? They know the benefits. They've been living to हर चीज, be it the scientific needs, be it the general needs, right from the the health of the forests to their own health. हर चीज में they have played a very important role. Okay, so again we have to give them the due credit here, right? And now, in addition to all of this, for example, if there is an international recognition, उसके बाद भी there is a need for a proper framework. Now, this can be done at the national levels. ठीक है, एक proper legal framework हो, maybe through which the rights are recognized and identified in a better manner, and there is even more legal recourse or protection या remedy हो वहाँ पे, वो भी हम देख सकते हैं. Okay, then the national biodiversity protection plans. अब देखो, there is a national biodiversity authority जो which is created under the Biodiversity Act of 2002. So maybe at the national level these authorities can create plans and more updated plans which include the, let's say, the rights of these indigenous people. Okay, so this is how we can go, and of course everything has to be very transparent. कैसे होगा ये ट्रांसपेरेंट? हाउ विल इट बी ट्रांसपेरेंट? दिस विल बी ट्रांसपेरेंट व्हेन वी एक्चुअली कंसल्ट दीज पीपल, व्हेन वी इन्वॉल्व देम इन डिसीजन मेकिंग, मोर पार्टिसिपेटरी अप्रोच, मोर डिसेंट्रलाइज्ड अप्रोच, right? So decentralized, participatory, bottom up approach, all of this is needed. So if we are able to carry all of this forward, then we will be able to implement first of all, the Global Biodiversity Framework. And from that framework, we have to create the national plans, the regional plans. But again, for that to happen, things have to be first happening at the global level as well. Okay? So with this, we come to the end of this topic. I hope from the whole mains angle, you learned a lot here, including the examples which we saw, both, let's say, the global examples of tribes, and again, the tribes which are in India. Again, let's say in the global examples, we saw the case of Maoris, okay, from New Zealand. We also saw the Maasai tribes, okay. We saw the indigenous people, local communities from Australia. And again, some examples from India, Soliga tribe, right, Kani tribe, right, again, Bishnoi communities, etc. You can also, and I also gave you example of Dongria cones, right. तो ये कुछ एग्जाम्पल है प्रोमिनेंट जिसको हम यूज कर सकते हैं, बट उससे भी ज्यादा अगेन वी हैव टू एम्फसाइज द वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट नीड हियर, right? So again, you can visit the Telegram channel for any further updates. You can also contact the team on the contact number provided here, okay? Again, we'll be meeting you very soon with the mains article discussion. Till then, keep revising. Thank you.